The line between light and darkness is rarely as clear as we would like to believe, and for those who perceive the world differently from the people around them, that line can blur in ways that few outsiders ever truly understand. Lauren Stewart was born on January 9, 1973, in the state of Michigan, a place she would call home for virtually her entire life. She came into the world as part of a large family, and growing up surrounded by siblings meant she never lacked for company or familiar faces. Yet despite that built-in sense of togetherness, her closest emotional bonds were reserved for only a handful of her brothers and sisters, a quiet selectiveness that seemed to foreshadow the deeper isolation she would carry with her into adulthood. From her earliest years, Lauren's life was shaped by hardship. She was not yet finished with high school when she suffered one of the most destabilizing losses a young person can face, the death of her mother. That grief settled into her in ways that would not become fully visible until much later in her life. In the immediate aftermath, she turned to two things that gave her structure and purpose: her studies and her faith. Both became anchors, both became shields. Her dedication to academic achievement and her devotion to religious belief allowed her to move forward, to outwardly project resilience at a time when she was privately carrying an immense and unprocessed weight. That drive eventually translated into tangible accomplishments. Lauren pursued work in acting and modeling, carving out a version of herself that was polished, presentable, and outwardly successful. She eventually settled in the small town of Keego Harbor, Michigan, a quietly charming community of roughly 2,000 residents nestled along the waterfront. With its modest streets and unhurried pace, Keego Harbor was the kind of place that seemed tailor-made for starting fresh, for building something steady and meaningful in the shelter of a close-knit community. It was there, in that peaceful and picturesque setting, that Lauren's life took one of its most defining turns. She met Daniel Stewart, the man who would become her husband and the father of her children. When they first crossed paths, Daniel was a focused and ambitious young man, committed to building a life through education and hard work. He embodied a philosophy that Lauren shared, the belief that diligence and learning were the foundation of a meaningful existence. That shared outlook drew them together quickly, and their connection deepened into something lasting. Daniel would go on to build an impressive professional career, eventually securing a position at the University of Michigan, where he worked as a programmer. His skills were sharp, his income was stable, and by all outward appearances, he was the kind of partner who offered security and solidity. Beyond their professional lives, Lauren and Daniel were bound together by their Christian faith. Both were deeply committed believers, and they made their local church a central part of their weekly routine, their social world, and their sense of identity. It was a faith community that for a time seemed to provide exactly what both of them needed. Together, Lauren and Daniel built a family. They had two children, a son named Stephen and a daughter named Bethany. Both children inherited their parents' ambition and their orientation towards self-improvement. Stephen developed a strong interest in computers and technology, fields that clearly required formal education and professional development. Bethany was drawn to the creative world of graphic design, a discipline she hoped to pursue through a university degree program. The family had the financial means to support both of those paths, and Lauren and Daniel were supportive parents who genuinely wanted their children to succeed on their own terms. But those aspirations placed the family directly at odds with the religious community they had built their lives around. The congregation they attended held strict doctrinal positions, among them an explicit prohibition against members pursuing higher education at traditional colleges or universities. In a small, tightly networked community like Keego Harbor, there was little room for quiet exceptions. When Stephen and Bethany enrolled in university programs, word spread quickly, and the family found themselves the subject of disapproving attention from people who had once been their neighbors, fellow worshipers, and social connections. Lauren and Daniel were not willing to let others dictate the futures of their children. They held firm, but that resistance came at a cost. The tension within the congregation began to grow, fed by whispered judgments and sideways glances that followed the family wherever they went. As early as 2011, Daniel made the decision to stop attending the church. It was a choice born of principle, but it opened a door to a kind of social pressure neither he nor Lauren had fully anticipated. The congregation's doctrine included a strict policy requiring members to completely sever ties with anyone who had left or been expelled from the community. Friends who had shared meals with them, neighbors who had waved hello for years, fellow parents who had sat beside them in the pews, all of them were now bound by religious obligation to cut contact. And then, because of her association with Daniel, Lauren was formally shunned as well. She had not made the choice to leave on her own terms. She was in effect expelled by proximity. Both parents remained firm in their conviction that their children's education was worth more than the approval of any institution, religious or otherwise. But the social fallout was relentless. A trip to the grocery store, a walk through the neighborhood, a simple errand that should have taken 20 minutes became an exercise in navigating hostility. Lauren frequently heard cutting remarks from people she had once considered friends. She absorbed those comments with the same composed exterior she had been presenting to the world for years, but inside, the accumulation of those small injuries was taking a toll. Time passed, and the situation did not soften. Years went by, and still the Stewarts found themselves living as outsiders in the community where they had built their home. The social cold shoulder that had begun with the church eventually extended to most of their immediate neighborhood. Interactions were minimal, strained, or openly unwelcoming. The family that had once been embedded in a living, breathing social network now found themselves largely cut off from it. Seeking some way to reconnect with the world and fill the gap left by that isolation, Lauren turned to fitness. She began going to the gym regularly, finding in physical exercise a structured routine that gave her days some shape. Thanks to her appearance and her energy, she was eventually offered a position as a fitness instructor at a facility in a neighboring town. She accepted, and for a time it seemed like a promising new chapter. But even that outward vitality could not mask what was happening beneath the surface. The Stewarts were quietly struggling across multiple fronts. Their finances had become a source of growing stress, compounded by the social pressures they were still navigating daily. Lauren was keeping up appearances with remarkable discipline, presenting a version of herself to the outside world that seemed upbeat and capable, while privately the weight of everything she was carrying was becoming unbearable. Those closest to her could sense that something was shifting, but the full extent of what she was experiencing remained hidden, even from those who cared for her most. On the evening of February 15, 2018, Lauren reached out to her cousin by text message. Message was cryptic but deeply unsettling. She wrote that she had decided to take her husband and children with her, so that they would not have to bear the burden of what she described as her selfish act. Her cousin read those words and felt a chill of confusion and alarm. She had noticed in the weeks and months leading up to that message that Lauren had been growing increasingly withdrawn, increasingly disconnected. But the precise meaning of that text was not immediately clear. Was she planning to move? Was she speaking in metaphor? Was she expressing something far darker? The cousin spent the rest of that evening trying to process what she had read. The next morning, February 16, 2018, she drove to the Stewart home to check on the family. She needed to see for herself that everyone was safe, to look Lauren in the eyes and understand what was happening. But when she arrived, the house was silent. She knocked. She rang the doorbell. She called out. No one came to the door. What struck her immediately was that both family vehicles were parked in the driveway. There was nowhere the family could have gone on foot at that hour, and the stillness inside the house felt wrong in a way she could not fully articulate. She waited for a time, hoping that perhaps they had stepped out for a walk or were simply not answering for some reason. But the longer she stood there, the more certain she became that something was seriously wrong. She contacted law enforcement. Officers from the Kego Harbor Police Department received the welfare check call at approximately 10 o'clock that morning. They arrived to find the cousin already waiting outside the home, accompanied by a close friend of Lauren's, both of them visibly shaken and anxious. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of street where houses sit close together and residents generally know each other's routines. Standing outside, the officers took note of several details that deepened their concern. Not only were the vehicles belonging to Lauren and Daniel present, but parked alongside them was a third car that belonged to the couple's adult son, Stephen. Though Stephen lived independently in another part of town, his vehicle was here, suggesting he had come to visit his family. And yet, like everyone else inside, he was not responding to the knocking, the doorbell, or the voices calling out from the front step. There was also one more unsettling absence. The family dog, which was known to bark and greet visitors, was completely silent. The officers listened carefully. No sounds, no movement, nothing but an eerie, absolute quiet from behind that front door. They made the decision to force entry, concerned that the family inside may have become victims of some kind of violent incident. Moving methodically from room to room, they cleared the ground floor before heading toward the other areas of the house. In the bathroom, they found the family dog, injured from a gunshot wound. The animal had not died immediately. The evidence on the floor told a grim story of suffering before the dog finally succumbed. The officers were now certain they were inside an active scene. Backup was called immediately, and additional patrol units converged on the address within minutes. With the house now more fully secured and additional officers in place, the team moved to the upper floor. Inside one of the bedrooms, they found 24-year-old Bethany Stewart. She had been fatally wounded by a single gunshot to the head. The evidence in the room indicated that she had been asleep when the attack occurred, tucked into her bed with no apparent sign that she had woken, moved, or struggled. A pillow had been placed over her face, suggesting a deliberate effort to muffle the sound of the shot. She had never been given the chance to wake up, to speak, to run. It had happened in an instant, in the dark, while she slept. The officers continued through the house. They found 27-year-old Stephen Stewart in the kitchen area, also without signs of life. He was still dressed in his street clothes, consistent with someone who had arrived for a visit and had not yet settled in for the evening. The manner in which he was found, seated at or near the kitchen table with a gunshot wound to the back of his head, indicated that he had been struck suddenly from behind, with no warning and no opportunity to react. Death had been instantaneous. In the basement of the home, investigators found 47-year-old Daniel Stewart lying near the sofa, in a position that suggested he had been seated and watching television when he became aware of someone's presence. One hand remained in the pocket of his trousers, while the other had been jerked outward so sharply that it tore the pocket lining as he instinctively reached out in the last fraction of a second of his life. It was a heartbreaking detail, a single reflexive gesture of resistance captured in the physical evidence. A man who had no more than a moment to realize what was happening before a gunshot to the head ended his life instantly. Near the base of the basement staircase, officers found 45-year-old Lauren Stewart. She was lying on the floor, and nearby was a Glock pistol. Lauren had died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. The arrangement of the scene and the location of the firearm told investigators the story of what had unfolded inside that house over what must have been a sequence of devastating minutes on the night of February 15th or the early hours of the 16th. 4 members of the same family were dead. 3 of them had been taken without warning, without a chance to say goodbye, without any indication that the woman who loved them had been quietly constructing this final act in her mind. The Kego Harbor Police Department immediately launched a full homicide investigation, treating the scene with the full weight of a major criminal case. The county medical examiner was called in to conduct forensic examinations, and investigators began the process of working outward from the house, speaking to neighbors, family members, colleagues, and anyone who had been in contact with the Stewart family in recent weeks and months. What they found was a portrait of a family living under layers of quiet desperation. Investigators discovered that Lauren had left behind written notes, along with a short video recording made in the final days before the incident. In that 2-minute video, she spoke about her pain, her sense of isolation, her feeling that the family had been cast out and abandoned by the community they had once called their own. Her words carried the weight of someone who had been quietly drowning and had finally stopped trying to stay above water. The investigators learned that Lauren had also sent a farewell message to at least one close family member before the events of that night, describing her state of mind and expressing what she believed was a kind of distorted mercy, a belief that by taking her family with her, she was somehow sparing them from the suffering she expected them to face without her. In the refrigerator, officers found it fully stocked with groceries. On the walls and surfaces of the home, there were notes and reminders about upcoming appointments, future plans, scheduled activities, all the small artifacts of a family that appeared to be moving forward in the ordinary rhythms of daily life. It was a detail that struck the investigators as particularly haunting. Lauren had maintained that facade of normalcy with extraordinary care and discipline, right up until the very end. She had apparently made sure that nothing in the visible life of the family would betray what she was planning. The investigation into Lauren's background painted a picture of mental health challenges that had never received adequate professional attention. She had been dealing with depression for years, a reality that multiple family members confirmed when interviewed by detectives. Some described it going back to the period immediately following her mother's death, when Lauren had absorbed that loss more deeply and more painfully than any of her siblings. At that time, the family had not sought professional counseling or therapeutic support. They had, like many families of their generation and background, managed the grief internally, leaning on their faith and their own emotional resources. According to the assessment of mental health professionals later consulted during the investigation, that unaddressed trauma had continued to compound over the decades, deepening and evolving in ways that were not immediately visible to those around her. Lauren had also experienced postpartum depression after the birth of her children, another period of significant psychological distress that did not appear to have received formal treatment. The departure from the church had carried its own psychological dimension. Even though Lauren and Daniel had made a principled and deliberate decision to prioritize their children's futures, the severing of those religious ties had left an emotional and spiritual void that Lauren in particular struggled to fill. Her faith had been central to her identity for most of her adult life. Losing that community, and then being formally expelled from it, had cost her something she never fully recovered. In the months before the tragedy, people who interacted with Lauren noted changes in her behavior. She had become more volatile, more easily agitated, more prone to sudden emotional shifts that seemed out of proportion to the circumstances that triggered them. She appeared distracted and emotionally distant during conversations, even with people she trusted. She had grown more overtly religious again in those final months, not in the organized, community-based way of her church years, but in a more private, intense, and increasingly idiosyncratic way. Investigators and forensic experts who reviewed her writings and communications concluded that Lauren had developed her own deeply personal framework of belief, one that blended religious conviction with a profoundly distorted view of life, death, and responsibility for others. In that framework, the idea that she was shielding her family by ending their lives was not an act of violence. To her, it was an act of love. That distinction, however unbearably tragic, was central to understanding the psychology behind what had occurred inside that house. Lauren's father, when interviewed by investigators, offered a more complicated and emotionally raw perspective on his daughter's life. He acknowledged that he had not spoken to Lauren in many years, a rupture in their relationship that predated the church conflict by some time. He struggled to provide a clear account of the difficulties Lauren had reportedly experienced in her younger years, and investigators were unable to find any official records documenting certain claims that had surfaced during the investigation. Her father believed that Daniel had played a role in gradually drawing Lauren away from her extended family, that the marriage had created a kind of closed circle that made it difficult for others to maintain close contact with her. Some of Lauren's siblings echoed that view, with one sister describing a 6-year period during which the two of them had no meaningful communication. That same sister suggested that Daniel may have had his own mental health challenges, and that the two of them had, over the years, reinforced each other's struggles rather than helping each other move toward healing. Other people who had known the family offered a different picture entirely. Several friends described Daniel as a warm, enthusiastic, and gifted individual who found genuine joy in his work and expressed a sincere belief that his professional contributions made the world a better place. A mutual friend who had spent time with the couple in the weeks before the tragedy recalled that Lauren and Daniel seemed deeply devoted to each other, that their bond was one of the most affectionate and committed she had ever witnessed up close. She described both of them as being openly aware of their own vulnerabilities to depression and said that they had made a conscious practice of looking out for each other because of that shared awareness. Friends and observers who had watched the family navigate the fallout from their departure from the church were consistent in their belief that the behavior of that community had played a meaningful role in the deterioration of Lauren's mental health. For 10 years following Daniel's initial decision to stop attending, the family had been subjected to varying degrees of social rejection, open hostility, and community-sanctioned isolation. Even when members of the congregation had dealings with local law enforcement or other institutions, witnesses recalled a detectable contempt for the Stewarts, a sense that their lives and their choices were viewed with disdain by those who had once been their community. A close friend of the family was so disturbed by what she perceived as the congregation's complicity in the family's suffering that she went directly to the church and confronted its leadership, holding them publicly accountable for the isolation that had, in her view, contributed to the deaths of 4 people. Her pain and her anger were shared by others who had watched the family struggle in the years since their departure. The toxicological examination conducted as part of the autopsy process found no evidence of alcohol in the systems of any of the 4 deceased family members. There were trace residues of marijuana detected in the systems of Lauren, Daniel, and Stephen, but investigating officers and forensic consultants agreed that those amounts were far too small to have played any causative role in what had occurred. The focus of the investigation remained squarely on Lauren's mental health history and the cascading series of pressures that had converged on her over the preceding decade. When the official investigation was concluded, detectives summarized their findings with a portrait of a tragedy shaped by multiple intersecting forces. The profound social isolation that followed the family's departure from the church, the crushing weight of financial strain, the absence of any meaningful therapeutic support over many years, the unresolved trauma that had followed Lauren since the death of her mother, and the progressive deterioration of her mental health in the months immediately preceding that February night, all of these elements had combined and reinforced each other in ways that ultimately proved fatal. Lauren had sent visible signals in the weeks and months before. She had spoken openly about wanting to die to at least one person who was close to her. She had expressed feelings of hopelessness, of being trapped, of being a burden to the people she loved. She had written about a persistent inner pain that she could not see any path through. Her cousin, who had noticed these warning signs more clearly than almost anyone else, had urged her on more than one occasion to seek professional help. Lauren had declined. The help that might have changed the outcome was offered, and it was not taken. Mental health professionals and crisis counselors, who later reviewed the case, identified multiple well-established indicators of serious risk that had been present in Lauren's behavior and communications in the period leading up to the tragedy. These included repeated expressions of a desire to no longer be alive, persistent feelings of anxiety and hopelessness without relief, a stated belief that the people around her would be better off without her, a sense of being permanently trapped in a situation with no visible exit, deepening withdrawal from social contact and emotional connection, dramatic and unpredictable shifts in mood, an escalating pattern of agitated or erratic behavior, and noticeable disruptions to her normal sleep routine. Experts in the field are consistent in their understanding that situations of this kind are rarely caused by a single event or a single moment of crisis. They are the product of long-term pressures, untreated conditions, and compounding circumstances that interact in complex and sometimes invisible ways. They also affirm with equal consistency that many of these crises can be interrupted, that with access to timely and appropriate mental health support, outcomes can be different. The story of the Stewart family is, in the end, a story about what happens when pain goes unaddressed for too long, when community structures meant to provide belonging instead become instruments of exclusion, when the internal resources of individuals and families are stretched beyond what any person can bear alone, and when the warning signs that precede the worst outcomes are present but go unanswered. If you or someone you know is struggling with the weight of depression, isolation, or thoughts of self-harm, please reach out to a mental health professional or contact a crisis support line. These crises can be survived. These situations can be changed. Help exists, and it is worth asking for.